Picture a hospital in New Orleans. No decorations on the walls, no balloons, no family in the waiting room. Just a tiny baby, born too soon, lying inside an incubator, with machines doing the breathing his small lungs couldn't manage on their own. 3 months went by. Nobody came. Not a grandparent, not an aunt, not a single person who said, "That baby is ours." He had a heartbeat, but no name that belonged to him yet. No arms waiting to hold him when he finally got strong enough to leave that hospital. And then, out of nowhere, a woman walked in. Not a social worker, not a distant relative, one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. And she looked at this little boy and said 4 words that changed everything. "He is my son." What happened next? And who that boy has become 16 years later is honestly one of the most quietly extraordinary stories Hollywood has ever produced. And almost nobody talks about it. Let's change that. To understand why Sandra Bullock's choice to adopt Louis hit so differently, you have to understand the world she was living in at that moment. Because she wasn't just famous. She was at the absolute peak of everything. Sandra was born in Arlington, Virginia in 1964, to a father who coached singers and a mother who was one. A German opera singer who raised her daughters between 2 countries and 2 languages. Europe, America, German, English. From the jump, Sandra's life was about adapting, about moving, about learning how to feel at home in unfamiliar places. That skill would matter more than she ever imagined. She hit Hollywood in the late 80s, grinding through small parts, barely making an impression, doing the thing every ambitious actor does before the industry notices them, waiting and working at the same time. Then 1994 happened. Speed. Keanu Reeves. A bus that couldn't slow down. And Sandra Bullock, cool as a blade, playing Annie Porter like she'd been carrying action films her entire career. Overnight, and I mean overnight, she became America's sweetheart. But she didn't coast on that. She shape-shifted. Romantic comedies. While You Were Sleeping. Then Miss Congeniality in 2000, which turned her into a global name. $212 million at the box office, a sequel, and a character so beloved people still quote her today. By 2009, though, she went somewhere deeper. The Blind Side. She played Lee Ann Tuohy, a Southern woman who takes in a homeless teenager the world had written off, and Sandra didn't play her as a saint. She played her as complicated. Flawed. Fiercely human. It earned $309 million. And in February 2010, Sandra Bullock stood on the Oscar stage, tearful, disbelieving, radiant, and accepted the Academy Award for Best Actress. On paper, that was the mountaintop. But behind that acceptance speech, something far more important was already quietly happening. While the whole world was focused on her Oscar win, Sandra was in the middle of something she hadn't told anyone. She was becoming a mother. Not through pregnancy. Not through a surrogate. But through a little boy in a New Orleans hospital. A boy whose story had started under the shadow of Hurricane Katrina, born premature into a city still figuring out how to stand back up. He spent the first months of his life fighting just to exist. His lungs, his tiny body, just surviving each day was its own kind of battle. And no one claimed him. That fact alone is worth sitting with for a second. This baby, who clearly had every reason in the world to be loved, was just waiting, with no one. Sandra was 3.5 months into the private adoption process when she first held him. She described that moment later with a kind of softness in her voice that people who had interviewed her for decades said they'd never heard before. "I looked at him," she said, "and I just knew. He was my son." She named him Louis Bardo Bullock. And everything, the Oscar, the cameras, the brutal, very public collapse of her marriage to Jesse James, all of it just fell away. Here's what strikes me most about this. Sandra didn't make an announcement. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't pose for a magazine cover with Louis as a prop for her image. She just quietly became his mother. And then she rearranged her entire life around that fact. The Sandra Bullock who had spent 2 decades sprinting, set to set, premiere to premiere, script to script, slowed down completely. She turned down major studio offers. Projects that would have made headlines, made money, made awards, season buzz. Gone. She just said no. Instead, she was doing early morning feedings and singing lullabies and figuring out what it meant to be the only person this little boy had in the world. She moved between Los Angeles and Austin, building something that looked less like a celebrity household and more like a home. A real one. With routines and bedtimes and school pickups and all the unglamorous, essential things that make a child feel safe. For years, Louis was almost invisible to the public. And that was entirely intentional. Sandra never sold his story, never used him as a content opportunity. The few glimpses the world got were accidental, candid, incidental. She said once, "There's something about holding this little boy who had no one that makes everything else feel small." 5 years later, in December 2015, she quietly revealed something else. A little girl. From foster care in Louisiana. 3 years old, already so strong, already so her. Her name was Layla, pronounced Layla, and Sandra described the moment she met her with the same unshakable certainty she'd felt with Louis. "There's no doubt in my mind," she said, "that she was meant to be here." And Louis, when Sandra told him he was getting a little sister, he looked up at her and said, "I knew she was coming, Mom." He was 5. For several years, Sandra's family grew quieter and more complete. Alongside her children, she built a relationship with photographer Randall, a man who seemed to understand deeply what she valued most: privacy, presence, protecting the kids from the noise. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't interested in the spotlight that Sandra could have shone on him any time she wanted. He was just there. Steady, loving, a real partner for the life she was building, not the life she used to have. By all accounts, he became a father figure to both Louis and Layla in the truest sense of the word. And then, in early 2023, came the kind of news that reshapes everything. Brian was diagnosed with ALS. Sandra's response was immediate and total. She walked away from Hollywood. No return date. No, I'll be back after this. She cleared her calendar, turned away every script, and gave every waking hour to caring for Brian and protecting her children from the full weight of what was coming. For about 1.5 years, she essentially disappeared. The world speculated. But those who knew her understood. She wasn't missing. She was exactly where she needed to be. Randall passed away in August 2023. Now, in the spring of 2026, there are whispers. Industry insiders say Sandra has started reading scripts again. Not with the hunger of her early career, but with the calm discernment of someone who has already proven everything she needed to prove, and now only says yes to what genuinely moves her. The most talked about possibility? A sequel to Practical Magic, reprising her role as Sally Owens alongside Nicole Kidman. For fans, that would feel like a homecoming. There's also quiet talk of something with Keanu Reeves, a reunion nearly 30 years after Speed changed both their lives. Maybe it happens. Maybe it doesn't. But here's what I keep coming back to. Sandra Bullock won an Oscar. She headlined some of the biggest films of her generation. She was, for a time, the highest paid actress in Hollywood. And she traded all of that, willingly, joyfully, for school pickups and bedtime stories and being present for 2 children who needed her. She didn't lose herself in that trade. She found herself. The greatest role of Sandra Bullock's career was never Leigh Anne Tuohy. It was never Annie Porter or Gracie Hart. It was Mom. And Louis, that premature baby from New Orleans that nobody came to claim, is living proof of what happens when one person decides, against all the noise and pressure and distraction of the world, to just show up. If you made it this far, drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know. Do you think Sandra should return to the screen? Or has she already given us her most important work? Subscribe if you're new. See you in the next one.